Please welcome the president of STR, Amanda Hite.
Good afternoon. It's good to be here with you. Today I'm going to spend our time giving you an overview of where we are today with hotel recovery around the world, and then talk about our views on what we think may happen with the potential recession next year, and look at some of the signals that we're watching to see how the hotel industry will fare over the coming year and the turmoil and uncertainty that is out there that gives us some confidence in the industry and also some concerns for the next year in the industry. So let's begin with room demand. Global hotel room demand obviously is much better today than our dark days of the pandemic back in March and April of 2020. But today we are still at 90% room demand index to 2019, so we're 10% off those 2019 levels of pre-pandemic. The last few months, we've seen the growth rates of hotel demand start to slow down, and we've really sort of hit this plateau at around 90%. So to get that last 10% of demand back, it's going to really take some challenging times over the next year for hotels to figure out ways to induce more demand to get us back to that pre-pandemic level. And while demand is slowly tiptoeing back to that pre-pandemic level, ADR for hotels has far surpassed our 2019 levels on a nominal basis. So reported ADRs have surpassed 2019 by a wide margin, but we all know we're operating in a high inflation environment. And when you take inflation out of the equation and look at real ADR, we've just in the last 2 months on a global basis gotten back to 2019 levels for average daily rate. Looking at RevPAR, which is our metric that we use in the industry that combines occupancy and average daily rate to give you that single number to give you some indication on a top line basis how profitability looks. On a nominal basis, we have 7 out of our 10 regions with RevPAR recovered past 2019. But when you take inflation out of the equation and look at real RevPAR, we only have 2 regions around the world that have gotten back to 2019 levels. So that's Central America, where leisure demand coming out of COVID has really driven the demand growth there. The average daily rate has been driven by the attraction of demand into those all-inclusive resorts in Central America. And then you look at the Middle East. The Middle East has benefited from a few things. First is the second half of Expo 2020, which drew some international travelers into the region. Dubai in particular was one of the first areas to reopen to international travelers and drop those COVID restrictions. So Dubai and UAE really benefited from those leisure travelers throughout Europe coming in, and that's helped propel the demand growth and the average daily rate growth in that area. When you look at sort of the worst performing here, which is Asia Pacific and mainland China. Let's start with Asia Pacific, not excluding China. Asia Pacific is an area that just really broadly reopened most borders in the countries in Asia Pacific in the second quarter of this year. So slowing recovery has sped up now because borders have been opened and people are able to travel in Asia Pacific. But Asia Pacific countries are very dependent in particular on the Chinese traveler. And the Chinese source market is closed to the rest of the world right now pretty much. And that has been a challenge for Asia Pacific. China in particular, the zero COVID policy has really created up and down performance throughout China. When cities are open, China is a market that is dependent on domestic demand before the pandemic. So when the cities are open, they're doing well. The challenge is not knowing when a city is going to lock down because of the zero COVID policy. And then once the lockdown happens, that does impact travel to other cities that are open. When people in Beijing or in Shanghai cannot get out of the city to go to other cities in the country, it's a challenge, and that will continue to be a challenge as long as the zero COVID policy is in place in China. Looking at our forecast for RevPAR for some of these areas, you'll see in most areas around the world, we don't expect to surpass 2019. In the UAE cities, the major cities, we do expect performance to continue to be above 2019. So in the UAE, the performance surpassed 2019 back in 2021 and has stayed above pre-pandemic levels. There's a calendar shift with Ramadan where you see that dip there in the first quarter, but really the UAE is an oil producer, does not have the same inflationary impacts that the rest of the world is experiencing, and really is dependent on intra-regional travel. And when you look at the GCC countries, they're all benefiting economically from the oil prices today, and there's continued investment happening in that region. So that will continue to propel RevPAR growth. The United States, we have been bumping right along around 2019 performance levels. We think we will just slightly surpass 2019 RevPAR growth in 2023, but pretty steady as she goes in the US. Do not expect major declines. Asia-Pac, just for the reasons that I mentioned earlier, it will continue to be challenging. China is the big question mark on when we see a wider border reopening for China. And then in Europe, we have leisure has driven the recovery in Europe, just like it has in most places. Europe has the energy crisis, war in Ukraine impacting it, and these are all areas that will weigh on leisure demand throughout the next year and also have some impacts on the business travel demand. So what about the recession? So we have known about the uncertainty in the macroeconomic environment, planned for it, it's been a part of our forecast. We had not been forecasting a recession, but last week our partners at Tourism Economics came out and issued a new baseline macroeconomic forecast for both the US and the Eurozone that 2023 will be a recession year. So what that means is our forecast is not changing dramatically, but it does create more issues for potential demand growth, because hotel demand growth is closely correlated to our GDP growth. And when you see GDP contracting, usually hotel demand is declining. And if it's expanding, then hotel demand is climbing. In this case, for the US in particular, we do think that there is some opportunity for this not to be a typical recession, for the hotel industry to not be affected in the same way that we've seen in prior recessions. So in the US in particular, the macroeconomic environment that we have today with rising prices, interest rates, this disproportionately affects lower income individuals. So lower income individuals in the US in particular are not the ones who are doing most of the travel, especially on the leisure side. So as we look at the spend of households, 41% in the US of travel spend happens in those households that are $150,000 or more. We are in an environment, a very tight labor market, where we have rising wages, which increases household incomes and allows households to still have disposable income to spend on travel. And after the pandemic, we know people want value travel. It's sort of a core value that we all think it's an important part of our lives. There has been such pent-up demand coming out of the pandemic. We feel really good about what travel looks like from this segment of the economy in the US. But there are some areas of concern and some signals to watch to continue to feel confident about what the industry will look like. The first area is business demand. So we all know companies are not back in offices. Occupancy rates across cities are very low in offices, and business travel has been the slowest to recover. We have said all along it was going to be leisure travel, followed by business travel, and then group. And that's how it's been happening. But business travel, as you see on the weekdays, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, this is indexing to 2019, has been the slowest to recover, and the indexes are much lower than what we saw for the weekend leisure traveler. And then the shoulder days are where you really start to see our famous term bleisure traveler. The Thursdays and Sunday occupancies are something that we really didn't pay a lot of attention to before the pandemic. Sundays were a day, I mean, we just wouldn't even, there was very low occupancies. But it increased coming out of the pandemic because so many people can work from wherever they want, and we see that. They're checking into hotels on Thursday, they're staying through Monday because they can work from the hotel on those days and then have the weekend to explore their destination and enjoy their vacation. So the challenge for us is that weekday business travel. We need that to come back. Will it ever get back to pre-pandemic levels? We've always said it's going to take several years. I think that's still the story. This potential recession next year could make it a little slower to recover. And part of the reason why we think that is when we look at corporate profits, we're in a recession environment, corporate profits are usually declining, which means corporations are, the first thing they cut is travel. And a lot of the big companies today aren't traveling the same way they were. The business travel that we are seeing today is more in small and medium-sized companies. And those are companies that, if corporate profits are declining, are going to go straight to cutting travel budgets. So that is one of the areas that we will continue to watch because it will impact our weekday business travel demand. But one of the signals that we're watching and that we're really positive about for the remainder of this year and into the first part of next year is group travel. So group travel has just in the second quarter and third quarter of this year started to come back. We're really positive about group travel helping to supplement the calendar and really carry us through the middle of next year. All of those group meetings that had been postponed during the pandemic have started to happen. The US has led the way because we've reopened the quickest coming out of COVID, but Europe is right behind and group demand is roaring back. And those people that have not met for the last 2 years are cramming their meetings sort of off schedule in the remainder of this year and the first part of 23. So that's a really positive signal for us that we think will help us with keep room demand at the levels that we are today and moving into 2023. Leisure demand. Leisure demand, we've said, has driven the recovery. This is a look at the regional UK leisure demand. Leading up to the pandemic, when you looked at regional UK, that's the UK minus London, it was an area that was actually seeing declining demand. The demand levels were about 75% just before the pandemic. And what we saw during the pandemic, as people started to travel for leisure again, they actually wanted to stay away from the big cities like London and go out into smaller destinations where you could be outside, and we saw incredible demand growth within regional UK. That regional demand within the UK and London is going to be what continues to support the hotel recovery over the next year. And our concern certainly is with a recessionary environment, Europe is going to be more impacted by rising interest rates, high inflation. Europe, in the UK in particular, and Australia, two of the things that we don't talk about very often is the rising interest rates impact on mortgage rates. Those are two countries that actually don't have long-term fixed mortgage rates like we do in the US. So they're dependent on a fixed rate over a short period, 3 to 5 years, or a variable rate mortgage. Well, as soon as central banks start to raise the interest rates, that immediately impacts the consumers. That is taking money out of their pockets to go to pay their mortgages, and that will impact the leisure travel in the UK market over the next year. So the last signal that I'll talk about is China. I've talked about China's importance to the rest of Asia Pacific, China's importance to the Middle East and the Chinese traveler, but I've said multiple times, when you think about where we are today, we were talking about the Chinese traveler in the US before the pandemic, how important it was to attract them because of the amount of money that is spent. We do think that with the Party Congress in the fourth quarter, the likelihood is that China will plan to have a wider reopening of borders in the first quarter of next year. So that is going into our forecast. We think that's an important signal to watch, because if that reopening does start to happen on a more broad basis, that's a good sign for the rest of the industry around the world to get Chinese travelers outbound into other countries. China is a country that we don't expect to see a recession. They are having a bit of a slowdown, but no recession next year, so we think that will be a positive signal. So there are many reasons to be confident across the industry in all the different regions that I've talked about. And there are also concerns across the region. Our key takeaways are recovery is almost back to 2019 levels. There are some recession impacts that we expect to see across the globe in 2023, but it will vary market to market, and there are reasons to remain confident in each of those markets. Thank you.